I'm delighted this morning to be able to present as our keynote speaker, a very good Catholic educator, good Catholic researcher, and I'm proud to say a good personal friend of mine. If you don't know the history of Holy Cross, and if you don't know the history of the congregation and its founding in post-French Revolution France, you need to know that history. And you need to know what Blessed Father Moreau intended in his work. And as was already mentioned, educating minds and hearts together was certainly his way of saying what we should all be about as Catholic educators. And he certainly was not shy about saying, among other things, that lay collaborators were very, very important to the work of the congregation. And so it is that we are blessed to continue that mission, continue that ministry, which started many, many years ago. And if you have not read Christian Education, and I think there were some copies available, you need to read this, because this is based on some of the writings of Blessed Father Moreau. When we talk about what we want to talk about today and looking to the future, I can think of no one who is more qualified to do that than Father Joseph O'Keefe, Society of Jesus, a Jesuit, as is the Pope, and he's quick to remind you of that the Pope is a Jesuit. Since 2013, Joe has served as the interim director for the Center for Ignatian Spirituality at Boston College. He's a tenured professor of education at BC. He was the dean of the Lynch School of Education at Boston College from 2005 to 2011. His doctorate is from Harvard University. He has given, I think, over 65 presentations on various topics related to education and related to the work particularly of Catholic education. He's an outstanding researcher, in my humble opinion, and I think in the opinion of many others, probably the best when it comes to finding out what we are about and finding out what we need to do in order to move forward. He has traveled the world, and one of the places that he was privileged to visit was the Vatican, and did a presentation in preparation for the centennial for the Vatican Congregation for Catholic Education, and Joe will talk a little bit about that in just a moment. He's also been currently serving as a member appointed by the U.S. Department of Education to the National Assessment Governing Board. And I always like that when they meet in Washington, because we get to connect together for dinner and get caught up with one another. Although he's a Jesuit, Joe has a family connection with Holy Cross, and I'll let him explain that when he steps up to the microphone. So there is no better person that I can think of that can help us look to the future, as our title of our session, Trends in Private Catholic Education to 2020 and Beyond. We struggle each day about what is it going to be like next year, but we need to think about where are we going to be in 2020? What is the lay of the land? And his presentation will also talk about not only the United States, but across the world. So join me in extending a warm Holy Cross welcome to a Jesuit, Father Joseph O'Keefe.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Well, let me start with a comment about my Holy Cross connection. Two of my grandfather's brothers were Holy Cross brothers in Montreal. One of them particularly every summer would come and visit. Frère Alcide Comtois had a huge impact on my life. I remember Uncle Alcide saying, you know, he died in the late 90s, and he said, you know, the Congregation of Holy Cross soon will have a saint. And of course it will be a brother. So delighted to be here with you, or I suppose I should say delighted to be with y'all. As Dan was saying, and represented here with folks from Bangladesh, from Brazil, perhaps from other countries too, I thought it would be helpful for us to think about the worldwide network of educators to which all of us belong. And so, on the one hand, taking a global vision, and yet looking at our particular context in the United States, in the 20-teens and into the 2020s, and especially being able with some hopefulness, but to look at the challenges that we face here within the U.S. So, Brother Donald asked me to prepare some questions related to the talk, and they will be handed out there at the back as you go. If they're helpful as conversation starters in your affinity groups, that's great. But as St. Ignatius would say with the spiritual exercises, if they're not helpful, don't worry about it. Move on to something else. So this is the worldwide perspectives, and again, you'll see that, and then looking at some of the U.S. context. Okay. I think that for many of us in the United States, sadly, this is what the world looks like. And I think especially for those of us in Catholic education, we tend to think in the United States that the glory days were in the 60s and that we're in a dying enterprise. Are we rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic? Yet, if you look at Catholic schools around the world, a very different picture emerges. So from the 1970s to the 20-teens, while in the US we have had significant decline, but if you look at our worldwide network of Catholic schools, and these are figures from the Vatican Congregation for Catholic Education, an enormous increase. A very different picture emerges. And we are part of that dynamic force for education in the world. 58 million children are educated in Catholic schools. That's an amazing force for the good. Reflecting, in terms of where people are, reflecting the nature of the church. Now, what I will call your attention to here, this is 1910. The pie chart to the left, the pie chart to the right is 2010. Look at Europe. Look at sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. How has the church evolved over that century? Significant demographic differences, and among the projections from the Population Reference Bureau, we can see the trend, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa especially, but also what this changing demographic will bring in terms of understanding the gospel, understanding theology, coming from a perspective that is not so exclusively Western European and North American. That can be a challenge for us, but it also is a time, I think, of great excitement. As Dan was mentioning, I've had the opportunity to spend some time at the Congregation for Catholic Education at the Vatican. And on February 12th, I happened to be there for the plenary. Every 3 years, the congregation meets, mostly all cardinals. It was kind of funny, actually, that someone who knows said there's been a change of fashion in Rome. Whereas it used to be the cardinals would be in their cassocks, and you could always tell the cardinals because they had the scarlet zucchettas. Most of them were dressed like me, right? So you couldn't tell who was a cardinal, who wasn't. And I was remembering in the Boston Globe last March, before the election, they had something called the Sweet Sistine. And it was the brackets, of who the potential popes would be. And so I was looking at, oh yeah, Philippines, oh, Brazil, oh yes. And so the congregation met, and two documents that were created, one in December, which was a document on intercultural dialogue and the importance of that within Catholic schools. And the second is what they call an instrumentum laboris, a working paper, which will be used to facilitate discussion. And the hope is 2015 will be a year of revitalization for Catholic schools across the world as we celebrate these various anniversaries. And in terms of the first, Cardinal Grocholewski, again, you can see, and this will be available on the website too, so you'll be able to see this PowerPoint. And when the Holy Father talked about the challenges, these are some of the, unfortunately, this is not yet translated into English, and my Italian is not good, so maybe the translation would be better for those who know Italian. But these are the kinds of challenges of identity, of community, of dialogue, a learning society, meaning so much of education, especially with technology, happens outside of a school context. Integral education, lack of means and resources, we all know what that's like. So these are the challenges that I think all of us face across the world in Catholic education. I think a key point is to be courageous, innovative fidelity, so that notion of taking the step carefully, but always taking a step of creativity and moving ahead. Quality preparation of formators, that it is for all of those who work in schools to see their work not simply compartmentalized into departmental specialization, but rather to see their work as one of formation. Entering with courage into present-day cultures and engage in dialogue with non-believers, with marginal believers, not just with the church-going Catholics, but with the nominal Catholics who fill at least a lot of Jesuit schools. And then every educator and the church as a whole is an educating mother, and it is required to change to meet the needs of the time. So back, even though we are called to be global citizens beyond this vision, yet we have to live where we are. And so I just want to raise 7 features that I think are helpful in reflecting upon the context of Catholic schools in the U.S. today. The first has to do with technology. You know, on the one hand, I think we all think about one-to-one learning and iPads and all of that. That's great, and I heard there was a great session yesterday about that. That's very important. But I think more broadly, technology has brought some very significant changes, for example, in the way we understand cognitive development, how the brain functions, what we know about learning. And it is technology that has allowed us to come to that greater understanding. Obviously, the web. I remember back in the early 90s, we had a faculty, one of our professors at the Lynch School of Education is a total tech kind of geek guy. And I remember the University of Minnesota had something called Badger, remember? What's that? Gopher, yeah, that's right. Sorry, I got my animals mixed up. Gopher. And maybe it was Badger too, I don't know about that. Gopher. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I can like look at library resources across the world, and I can sit at my desk at BC. And I remember Alex said, now, there's something coming. It's going to be really good. It's called the World Wide Web. And it's going to be faster, and you'll have images. And I'm like, I'm sticking with Gopher, right? But when we think, and as I look around the room, I think most of us are what we would call, immigrants into the world of technology, not natives in the world of technology, but to think about the web and how that's changed the world. A whole new meaning to what the word icon means, and all of that. So really, it's a change, I think, in many ways of space and time. And for those of us trying to get into the heads, especially of Generation Z, right? The ones who are so immersed within technology. But questions of human identity, certainly what we know, how quickly we know. I mean, I've just become so impatient when I'm looking for data for this, that, and the other thing. I expect it to be instantaneous. How we focus. And the whole multitasking world that is open to us because of technology. How we relate to others, and technology has brought great benefits, but also challenges in that regard, and with whom we relate. The latter two, I think, when we think of ourselves as global educators within this Catholic context, the opportunities for connection across the globe become so endless in many ways. So again, Generation Z, we know all the changes that have taken place. People talk about exponential change. Who knows what technology will bring? But what we do know for sure is that technology will continue to bring enormous changes, especially in the way we do education, right? Accountability. You know, it used to be Catholic schools are great because we know they're great, trust us. Those days are gone. We live in a world that is all about standards and benchmarks and evidence. And in many ways in the US, now who's old enough to know what this is? Sputnik. We had a session for the National Assessment Governing Board where, as Dan said, I belong to that, and I represent the private school community. I represent you on this National Assessment Governing Board. And Arnie Duncan was the speaker, and immediately it was comparison to South Korea. We are falling behind. So this push for productivity, and especially when there's a sense of the public of the weakening of American political and economic power, there's this whole push that we need to create a generation of geniuses who can dominate industry, right, and all of that. It's a competitive idea, and some of the international, interesting, we've tracked some of, for example, the media reports. PISA, the one on top, is, as you can see, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Every release of data, and the one below, TIMSS and PEARLS, are both happen to be housed at Boston College. International Comparative Studies of Student Achievement. You know, and at times in certain tests we find, you know, we're behind Bulgaria, or we're behind, and how the media picks up on this, just as the Sputnik reality, and then, who remembers in the Reagan administration, the rising tide of mediocrity, right? Again, economic competitiveness, much of the race to the top. So the fact is, it's a very standards, evidence-based reality. Again, the National Assessment of Educational Progress that we oversee with the governing board is the only test of achievement among American students. It's done by sampling. Some of you may have been, some of your kids that maybe are in your school participated in NAEP. One of the good things for us is time and time again, when we look at NAEP results, and thankfully we have enough people in Catholic schools who participate that the N is high enough for us to be able to make some comparisons. And time again, Catholic schools in particular, private schools more generally, students in those schools do extraordinarily well in a number of subjects. Math, reading, but also things like civics, civic engagement. You know, right now we're working on assessments of TEL, technology and engineering literacy, looking at math and science in an applied way. So these national tests, and we also look at issues, data that the Department of Ed compiles regarding educational attainment. And again, Catholic schools do extraordinarily well compared to our peers elsewhere. And then does anyone recognize this alphabet soup? They are all acronyms of state tests of academic achievement, right? What's the one here? TAS? Or what's the Texas? Okay, yeah. MCAS in Massachusetts Comprehensive Assessment System. And of course, now we're moving toward the Common Core. Texas not one of the states, right, by the way, in the Common Core. A lot of debate about the Common Core. Folks at NCEA are going, and it's not adopting the Common Core. What I think is more important is adapting the Common Core. I told one of my colleagues in political science, I said, if you want a really interesting study, you should study the reaction to the Common Core, because it's really about political ideology much more than substantive issues. So when you say, let's look at standards for math in the 4th grade, well, everyone said, well, of course 4th grade kids need to know this, but if it's part of the Common Core, it's part of like government takeover. And I love this little graphic of, you know, the scare factor. Common Core is going to create little zombie kids. So yeah, you got to be careful about that. And then not just government, but also private organizations, ACT, SAT, and again, here you can see how well private schools do in regard to SAT scores. Higher education. In many ways, I think the canary in the mine of high schools is what we are facing now in higher education. Let me talk about some of the challenges of higher education. Sister, I'm sure you could have a lot to say about that too. One of the most frightening in many ways and insightful reports was done January 2013 by Moody's, and they're the people who determine debt ratings. Enormously important when you're doing all your building here at a place like St. Edward's. And they downgraded the entire sector of higher ed. And they downgraded the entire sector of higher ed because of price sensibility continues to suppress net tuition growth. In other words, it's more expensive than tuition can possibly cover. Non-tuition revenue sources are strained, and diversity of investments no longer a safe haven. Rising student loan burden, huge. And it taints the perception of the value of a college degree. Increased public scrutiny. Why does it cost so much? Why do we have tenured professors? Why are they so expensive? Enormous skepticism about the higher ed sector. And prospects for long-term sustainability depend on leadership through better governance and management. The other thing that we face in higher ed are for-profit that tend not to have any tenured faculty or traditional departments. They are nimble. There's nothing nimble about a traditional university. And a lot of people are making a lot of money in that for-profit, much of it being online, much of it being very technically oriented. And we know Catholic education is more than passing on technical skills or just job skills. But that for-profit world, coming to secondary ed soon, perhaps. MOOCs. Everyone hear of MOOCs? Massive online courses, open access courses. Already, like MOOCs, we're finding, for example, in high-level specialty areas in secondary education, a number of companies producing curricula. Will they put you out of business? No. But certainly it's there. Skepticism about higher education, and for those schools that tout what we do in our high school, I know the 50 Jesuit high schools, we prepare people to go to college. And that used to be an enormously attractive thing, but there's great skepticism. Who are the figures who make us skeptical about higher ed? Yeah, Steve Jobs, right? Warren Buffett. I mean, you name it, and that say, you know what? College is just not worth it. And that is exacerbated by, I think, the memory of the recession. I don't know, have you ever heard of the Lawler Group? They're out of Minnesota. It's kind of interesting, at least in the higher ed world from my perspective, and also in secondary and elementary ed in the private sector. The people who are really doing very well are the consultants who will help you come up with a strategic plan, who will help you do a capital campaign, who will help you do marketing. Right? Those folks are doing great. Right? And so the Lawler Group came to Loyola New Orleans, where I'm on the board of trustees. We had a shortfall of 250 students in the entering freshman class, a resulting $8 million deficit in our operating budget that we had to make up. And so we're looking for solutions. Do we need to downsize? I know some of you are from New Orleans, but it's a big challenge for Loyola. And one of the things that they said, and I don't know if it's true, but it was really provocative. For those of us who had parents who lived through the Depression, that memory of the Depression had a huge imprint on them. I mean, my mother would save stuff, and it's like, well, Mom, why are you doing that? Well, you got to be frugal, and that memory of the bread lines and all. Now, the folks from the Lawler Group claim that as they're going all across the country, for many millennial parents, or those who will be parents, this imprint of the Great Recession has marked the way they look at their priorities, the way they spend money, what they think is important. I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but there is something to it, especially when you look at these kinds of figures, which are median household income in the 21st century. Now, up top is nominal growth, but this is real growth, which includes inflation. So look at that. It's a history of real decline, and especially when you think in the United States in 2014, $50,000 a year is the median household income. I did a session in one of our suburban parochial schools, St. Catherine's in Norwood, a school doing very well, 500 kids in this parochial elementary school, talking to the teachers about needing to be intentional about Catholic identity because otherwise why do you exist, kind of thing. And I said, let's say you have a kindergarten kid coming into St. Catherine's School, 8 years. Let's say it's a boy and he ends up going to the Zavarian Brothers High School for 4 years. And let's say he gets into Boston College and ends up with a bachelor's degree. That will cost $380,000, not accounting for inflation. I think when people think about the recession and what happens in the recession, $380,000 for a Catholic education is pretty steep. And here we have not only is education expensive, but with the shift in terms of income inequality, there are significant issues related to mission. In some ways, sadly, I think for many Catholic schools, there are two choices: extinction or elitism. We could probably fill a freshman class with full-paying customers at Boston College. But Boston College was founded in 1863 to serve the needs of those who were discriminated against because they were Irish Catholic immigrants. It was a working class place up until the 70s and 80s. What happens when our education, when Catholic education is inaccessible not only to people way at the bottom of this income distribution, but increasingly the children of middle-class parents? I was talking to Marco, and I are both Holy Cross alums, the College of the Holy Cross, right? The Jesuit college in Worcester. And we were talking about this kind of eliting of a place like Holy Cross. When I was there, there were kids of blue-collar workers. My dad, he had a college degree. He was an IRS agent. He was a civil servant. We didn't have a lot of money. That was very common. Children of nurses and nurses and teachers. But we're becoming, in many ways, if you're very poor, perhaps you'll get a full scholarship. And there's not, we can't do that for many. A place like Loyola, New Orleans, we have 55% discount rate. I mean, that's great. I wish it were 100% discount rate that every Jesuit school was totally free. But you can't sustain that. So how do we face these challenges economically? And again, the impact of recession by social class. And then, of course, the huge issue related to debt. What the Lawler Group also said, they find increasingly that scenario of St. Catherine's in Norwood, that kid who went to Catholic elementary school, Catholic high school, and a Catholic private university, saying, well, you know what? If we send the kid to the Catholic elementary school, then maybe he or she will have a kind of foundation, and that's all we can afford. Or adolescence is a time when all hell can break loose in the lives of kids. So we'll send the kid to the public school or the charter school for elementary, and then the kid can go to Holy Cross High School, but there's no way he can go on to Notre Dame or St. Edward's, go to the state university. So these economic issues are huge, and this is an interesting study that was done by Catholic educators and Jewish educators. And basically, they claim the number of low-income households will increase by 17.8% by 2020. Affluent households will decrease. Median income has already fallen, and the middle class is predicted to shrink over the next 3 to 5 years. I am not saying this to depress you all, but we need to have our eyes wide open and deal with the realities that we face. Another economic situation, and this is a study that was just completed last week, looking at personnel in Jesuit high schools across the United States. So you can see in 1960, there were 564 lay teachers in 47 high schools and 1,308 Jesuits. In 2014, there were 3,869 lay teachers and 169 Jesuits. Now, that brings all kinds of opportunities, as Dan was saying, Blessed Basil, the importance of lay people, and at least for us, I think lay people have brought a wonderful experience of the spiritual exercises that has enriched Jesuit schools tremendously. The experience of being a parent, the experience of being a spouse, the insights into God that come from that. But my point is there are significant economic realities here. We have a number of places now where Jesuit administrators, chief administrators are being replaced by lay people, and the kind of shock to the budget, right? And increasingly, even if you do have religious, that old model of being able to provide accessibility because your staffing was basically all volunteer, I earn a full salary. I don't see much of it because it goes to the community, but I've got a whole lot of older brothers that I need to take care of, right? So that's the personnel issue. Of course, fundraising is crucial, that when we find the constraints of no longer being able to increase tuition, debt burden, all of that, so that philanthropy becomes what we turn to. But yet, if you look at, this is IRS figures, self-reported are the lighter, IRS figures are the darker, but this is up to 2009. And those figures, that trend would continue, that again, that imprint of the Great Recession is really making people less reluctant to be able to give away significant amounts of money. People are insecure financially. I know, especially when I was a dean, a lot of the work that we do, we would look for the big, major gifts. And people would say, you know what? I can't make a 5-year commitment. I can give you X amount this fiscal year, but I can't make a long-term commitment. So philanthropy is squeezed. Also, the changes in the nature of philanthropy, as I say, not only hands-on, but hands-in. So also, how do you deal with major donors and maintain the sense of being an educator, having a mission? And it's not that donors aren't appreciative, but they come from a business world very often. And so how do you make sure there aren't strings attached that you don't want? This is a lovely little piece if you haven't seen it. I love the title, From Here to Eternity. It's a briefing on trends in U.S. Catholic philanthropy. And if you look, for example, in the world of philanthropy, the increasing competition for the dollars of wealthy people, the increase in the number of nonprofit charitable organizations, generally and within the church in particular. In other words, there are many more people who want to have their hands in the wallets of your donors than 15 years ago. And this is something called nextgendonors.org, and you can see some of the issues that we face within philanthropy. A grayer America, major gifts more important, even though harder to get, etc. The education marketplace. We live perhaps in the most capitalist culture in human history. And that has affected all domains of life, not just the for-profit sector. Healthcare, an example, and education. And the way education works, traditionally kind of more of a political ideology of the Republican Party, less government engagement, let the free market do its thing. But I can't tell you, the Obama administration and Arne Duncan espousing all these market reforms of education. And in many ways, back to that accountability issue, people think about which school to send their kid the way they think about which car they want to buy, right? What's the best value for the dollar? I can go to, the Toyota dealership, but I'm going to do a Carfax report to make sure, right? They do the equivalent of Carfax reports on schools, so that report cards are not just for students anymore. I just completed, I just had a student defend a dissertation which was looking at how district superintendents in Massachusetts perceive charter schools. Now, you'd think it was charter schools are the creation of Beelzebub, right? I mean, so, okay, there's that, right? But charter schools in the legislation were created as laboratories of innovation that then would be brought back to district schools, right? To the larger world of district schools. That rarely has happened, and the innovations within districts tend to be things like we hired a PR person to keep kids in the district, or we increased AP classes, or international baccalaureate. Even though the elementary schools need a lot of work, but we wanted to have a fancy swimming pool in the high school because parents are asking for it, right? So it's this whole consumer demand, and Catholic schools, any private schools are part of that. But within that, look at the growth of charter schools. And both in terms of number and in terms of numbers of students. For the first time since 1920, there are fewer than 2 million students in Catholic schools. There were 2.5 million students in charter schools. Often charter schools, and I've seen it, say, we're Catholic schools without Catholicism. We have uniforms. Kind of a superficial take on what Catholic schools are, We have strict discipline. The school is safe. Now, we don't have firm data on how charter schools have impacted Catholic school enrollment, but I am certain that it's been significant. It's very hard to track with precision what those numbers are. The other growth area is homeschooling. That's the largest growth area in American education, growing even faster than charter schools. Part of that, religious issues, and believe it or not, there were homeschooling organizations that say your Catholic schools aren't Catholic, right? So sometimes it's for kind of a religious or social ideology, but increasingly, I think, technology will create many more homeschooling opportunities. Why send a kid to your high school when you can get a MOOC and do the science and math and English and history courses? May as well stay home, huh? There's that. So, market choice, district charter, private homeschooling, cost, evidence of quality, long-term educational goals versus expenditures, cost-benefit analysis, return on investment, and value and values. And how do we swim around in that environment? Demographic changes, geographic shifts. For those of you in Texas, congratulations. You're riding the wave of demographic change in the United States. For those of us in Massachusetts, I'm on the board of our high school in Portland, Maine. I mean, the demographic picture is really sad, the depopularization. And this looks at by states. Again, you can see Texas, Colorado, Utah, and this is the percent change of high school graduates up to 2020. In many ways, and I don't know the geography of Holy Cross schools well enough, but certainly for Jesuit schools, we tend to be where the population, the Catholic population especially, was plentiful 100 years ago. And we tend not to be where the Catholic population is today, because we can't pick up institutions from the Northeast and Midwest and plop them in Phoenix. Not only geographic changes, but as we all know, ethnic changes in the U.S. population. And so to what extent are our schools welcoming to people of various ethnic backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds? We're involved in our Roche Center for Catholic Education at BC, a very interesting initiative called Twin Two-Way Immersion Network, and it's 12 Catholic elementary schools that have two-way immersion, language. English-speaking kids, native English-speaking kids learn in Spanish, native Spanish-speaking kids learn in English, and then we create opportunities for them to come together. That kind of, and there is a long history within the Catholic school community in the U.S. of responsiveness to local cultures. You know, when I was growing up in my infamous hometown of Salem, Massachusetts, there were 8 Catholic parishes. Only 3 of them were territorial, right? What we call the Irish churches. But you had the French Canadian, you had the Italian, you had the Polish, and they all had schools where at least half the day, I mean, certainly immersed in the culture of those ethnic groups, but often immersed in the language of those ethnic groups too. And this is the non-white share of public high school graduates, which would give a sense especially of these diversity issues, and it really is along in the South. And the church, now, look at the percent of Catholics, right, who were non-Hispanic white. Pre-Vatican II, 96% of pre-Vatican II Catholics, non-Hispanic white. Down to 50% among the millennials. 2% Latino of pre-Vatican II, 45% millennials. And that trend will continue. So not only is there ethnic diversity generally, but if you look at race and ethnicity, especially, Catholic schools will need to educate very significant numbers of Latino kids. That's the future demographic of our church. Changing gender roles, the role of women, was interesting with the congregation, the focus on the education of women, literacy among women. But, you know, if you included Catholic schools generally, about 85% of people who work in Catholic schools, teachers or administrators, are women. So this whole question of the changing role of women, and what does that mean for a Catholic community, and changing households. You know, how many of you have the Cleaver family in your school, right? First marriage, husband, wife, 2, 3 kids. That's going to become a minority. So what does that mean in terms of diversity of family structure? Changing notions of marriage and these kinds of relationships. That's a change for us and a challenge for us. When we look at issues related to security and terrorism, this is just a brief reminder of what happened to us in Boston last Patriots Day and the marathon, the kind of insecurity that we face, global warming. All of these issues, I think, need to be at the forefront of what we do as Catholic educators. And how do millennials respond to this? How do the people in our schools now, how do younger faculty respond to this? These are some of the values that they see. Again, jobs and unemployment, a sense of insecurity. It's a far less secure world than when I was growing up, and I'm 59 years old. Consumer culture. How do we present other values? Juliet Shore is a sociologist at BC. And her research claims that by the time kids get to school, they know at least 200 brand names. And so as a result, a kind of superficiality, a consumerism, and it's not that young people are less altruistic, but they're bombarded by this message and culture that you are what you own. Right? We have a very different Christian vision, don't we? But it's a challenge. Issues related to anxiety, depression. Sociologists would claim, and psychologists, that we have the most heavily medicated generation. I don't know about counseling center here, but our counseling center is out straight. The issues of mental illness, the question of how many kids need psych drugs to stay balanced. Part of that has to do with the enormous pressure. Right? You are what you achieve, and if you don't achieve, anxiety, depression, How do we convey in our schools that each of the students in our schools is unconditionally loved by God, has dignity, worth, value? Our culture sends a different message. And we have to help students learn how to fail. And if you deal with helicopter parents, or snowplow parents is the new thing now. They plow away all the obstacles right before. So I don't know how good it would be with marketing to say, we teach students to fail, right? But failure is an inevitable part of life, and some of them never experience it, right? And then finally, this moral therapeutic deism, more the religious issue. I don't know if you're aware of the work of Christian Smith, a sociologist, now at BC's football rival, your place in South Bend. Does great work looking at religious identity and spiritual development of what he calls emerging adults, both adolescents and as we know, adolescence sort of continues until age 30 now, I think. And we're kind of following up with some of that, doing a study of kids in Jesuit high schools to see if Jesuit high schools make any difference in kind of, and moral therapeutic deism, I don't have time to go in detail, but basically what it's a very anemic kind of form of, yeah, there's a God, but, whatever. And so a more robust religious identity is a real challenge. And we've seen the figures, The importance of religion by generation, and we can see increasingly less so. The Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, time and time again, looks at generationally the lack of religious adherence. I often tell people when we look at a lot of the sociology of religion, there's a guy by the name of Mark Chavez who did an interesting, he's out of Duke, did an interesting study on religious identity in America. And he says, the big increase in religion in America are the number of nuns. N-O-N-E-S. Those who have no religious affiliation at all. And how do we work with families? I think one area that we need to be much more aware of is the importance of family. This is a study just published last month that looks at generational, handing on the faith by generation, and the importance of families. The chapter I really like, I actually used it when I was preaching on the Feast of the Presentation. Anna and Simeon, the two elderly ones in the temple. The role of grandparents in opening up kids to religious faith. Kind of interesting. And we know the figures about the church. 1/3 of adults who were baptized Catholic in the U.S. are no longer. We are the second largest, former Roman Catholics are the second largest denomination. There you go. And not only that, but this chart talks about those who would claim religious identity is really important. What Smith and his colleagues found, and what we find with the general population, that many people who call themselves Catholics but say, religion's just really not that important in my life. We have a lot of work to do. Recovering from the scandal certainly had a big impact on my community. I don't know about Holy Cross, but diocesan priests, how do we deal with that? A highly polarized church. How many of you have to deal with these issues of right-wing, left-wing Catholic and the fights and parents? I hear it all the time from administrators within schools. Again, you're not really Catholic enough, or you're not Catholic the way I want you to be Catholic. Is there a new direction and a new moment? This is a little unfair, I suppose, but in some ways to say, a more pastoral approach, is the Francis effect really making a difference? Bottom line, you need to change. You need to be open. And for some of the issues for Catholic schools, here, I'm quoting my favorite author, myself, and some of the issues I've talked about, the geography issues, seeing teaching and leadership as ministries, not just jobs, partnerships and networking among various kinds of agencies, privatizing Catholic schools. What we mean by that would be moving more toward the kind of schools that you have, where parishes and dioceses are no longer really able, by and large, to be able to direct significant systems of schools, seeking public help and getting full credit. That book was just published actually in January. This is the book that I talked about, the Jewish and Catholic, both looking at religiously affiliated schools. A story I always tell groups that, and I have a number of friends in Jewish education, I think we have so much in common with them. And I was involved in a study group way back in the late 90s of Jewish educators and Catholic educators. And I remember one of the rabbis, Reform rabbi, said, we're building these day schools and investing money in these day schools. He said, and the reason is it's the great tragedy for a young Jew to grow up without knowing the joy of a Jewish way of life. So what a lovely thing. So I've said, as a rationale for our schools, it's such a tragedy for a young Catholic to grow up without knowing the joy of a Catholic way of life. And when I've said this to various groups of teachers and board members, if people are candid, often they say, Father, joy and Catholicism? I don't put those things together. It's a religion of no, not, prohibited, illicit. Right? But I think we're at a place where we see a joyful Catholicism and how crucial that is. And then finally, just some other points. We have an emotional attachment to the status quo. We're hardwired that way, I think, as human beings. We often have a lack of knowledge about the current reality, right? Some of the issues, contextual issues I talked about. Denial of the need for change, right? As they say, everyone loves improvement, but no one wants change. Lack of imagination about possible futures. I think that is so important. We can't imagine our schools looking different than they do now. And yet, when you think of all the things I've been talking about, this has to be a time of innovation, of creativity, of new models, of new ways of being school. And to do that, at times you're going to fail. I don't know about the Holy Cross Network, but certainly among the Jesuits in the history of, there were a whole lot of efforts in Catholic schools in the U.S. over its 250-year history that failed. But if they hadn't tried, we wouldn't have any of the success stories, right? Don't be afraid to fail. Be bold. And insecurity about the future. So I end with Papa Francesco. Seek new, unconventional forms of education to comply with the needs of people, times, and places. Balance the place of safety with the zone of risk. And finally, education cannot be confined to the zone of safety. And I think one of the exciting things about a gathering like this, the collective creativity among you, and the encouragement of one another across schools to step out of that zone of safety. I think for all of you in particular, when the world looks daunting, when the options are scary, when the future is uncertain, I want to leave you with a motto that my Uncle Alcide knew so well. Have hope. Thank you for having me with you. Congratulations, and God bless in all your important work.
Joe, in many ways, you've given us too much to think about, but it is amazing when you think about all of these issues that you have raised, and what really resonates with me is take the risk. And that's the way we have to move forward. So thank you again so much.